When we look at social policy, we are also concerned about the process that goes into the social policy. Because what you see as a policy is a product of several processes. So that a good policy should undergo certain processes, and some good work needs to be done at each stage in order for the final product of the policy to be useful, or for a policy to be good for that matter. So when you talk of policy making process, we basically mean the process that is undertaken by policymakers, which in most of what we call public policy is the government or government agencies, to meet the needs of people or to protect their rights or to distribute resources or to enforce certain laws or address other national interests. So basically, it is a process that a policy goes through for that policy to be developed and therefore to be implemented. So I want us to look at the process that a policy goes through. Normally, a policy goes through 7 steps, or what we call processes. The first step is what we call problem identification. The second step, we call it option analysis. The third step is called formulation of policy. The fourth step, we call it adoption of the policy. The fifth step is called implementation of the policy. The sixth step, we call it evaluation of the policy. And then the seventh step, we call it policy termination. We want to spare some time to understand what each step is and the various activities that are undertaken within each step. So when we start with step 1, which is problem identification, first we need to understand what is it that we call a problem in the context of a policy. So a problem in the context of a policy is the issue that has been identified as requiring certain interventions for purposes of addressing it. It could be poverty, it could be, say, gender-based violence, it could be conflict, it could be corruption, or it could be, say, funding of university education or funding of orphans and vulnerable persons. That becomes the problem. So the first thing that is done is, in a policy-making process, you identify the problem that you would wish to be addressed through a policy. So the first thing is you come up with a problem. Once a problem is identified, that problem has to be properly defined, it has to be properly understood, and it has to be stated in a manner that makes it clear and not ambiguous. So problem identification becomes the first step in a policy-making process. The second step is what we call the option analysis. When we talk of option analysis, basically we mean coming up with various ways on how to address the problem that has been identified in step one. For example, let's take the case of university funding. There could be several ways of funding university education. It could be government coming in, it could be private sector coming in, it could be family coming in. So those are various options, or it could be a combination of those options. So when you come up with different ways of addressing a problem that has been identified in step one, those different ways are what we call the policy. Those are the ones that we call options. Now, analysis of those options simply means trying to scrutinize each of those options, laying bare the advantages and disadvantages of each option. So analysis simply means coming up with different ways of addressing the problem and then evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of each of those routes that have been identified as a better approach to addressing the problem. So when we talk of option analysis, we simply mean understanding which route or which of the alternative route is good in terms of its strengths and weaknesses. Can one route be taken, or can it be a combination of different alternatives? So option analysis basically means trying to understand the various options that are available in terms of addressing the problems, then evaluating their strengths and weaknesses before arriving at one of them or a combination of them. Then the other one, we call it policy formulation. That becomes step three, policy formulation. Policy formulation simply means now drafting the policy, putting the policy into a language that is understood, that is clearly understood. In other words, you have identified the problem, you have analyzed different ways of addressing those problems, and you have arrived at certain options. Now you put those options into writing. You now develop what you call a draft policy. So the process that leads to the development of a draft policy, that is what we call policy formulation. And that one is undertaken in step three. Once a policy is evaluated, that policy then needs to be adopted. It has to be adopted. Adoption simply means domiciling a given policy into a specific government agency that will now implement it. Because you cannot have a policy and then that policy has no proper agency to implement it. Some policies can be implemented by an already existing government department or agency, but others might require the establishment of a completely new government department or agency to implement it. So the process of domiciling a policy that has been formulated into a given department or a given government agency for purposes of embracing it and implementing it, that is what we call policy adoption. Then, of course, once a policy has been adopted, that policy now has to be implemented. And that is why the fifth step of policy making process becomes what we call now policy implementation. By implementation, with regard to policy, we mean the actual enactment of the proposed solutions for purposes of addressing the issues that have been identified. Maybe you said you want to come up with a system of funding higher education in a given country, and you came up with various ways. Implementing it now means the actual funding, putting a policy into operation for purposes of addressing the issues that the policy was formulated to address. That is what we mean by policy implementation. Implementation might mean employing personnel to implement the policy. It might mean allocating resources, such as finances, to implement the policy. It might also mean establishing rules and regulations to guide the implementation of a given policy. So that becomes quite clear in terms of implementation of a policy. So that becomes the fifth step, and it is quite an important step. Once a policy is implemented, of course, implementation can take several years depending on the issue. Then the policy has to be evaluated. The policy has to be evaluated. When we evaluate a policy, we are basically concerned about what is it that is working as it was envisioned by the time the policy was conceived and formulated, and what is it that is not working. So evaluation basically seeks to understand the extent to which certain proposals that were put forward in the policy are working, and what needs to be done to strengthen what is not working well so that it can work well. So when we talk about evaluation, it is not so much to look at the weaknesses of the policy, but rather to understand what is working and what is not working. And if something is working, what is it that needs to be done to make it even work better? And if something is not working, what is it that needs to be done differently so that what is not working can now work better? Because at the end of the day, the interest of every policymaker is to make the policy work. And therefore, if certain things are not properly working, then there is need for those issues to be looked at again for purposes of strengthening them so that they work at the end of the day. Then, of course, we have what we call policy termination. Termination is the last stage. Sometimes people fear calling it a stage, but we call it a stage because no policy exists forever. A policy might be terminated, one, if it is declared by a court of law that it is unconstitutional and illegal. For that matter, the policy will be terminated on the strength of a judicial pronouncement. A policy might also be terminated if it is realized that it is not achieving its intended objective. Quite enormous resources are being put into its implementation, but no meaningful change is coming. On that basis, again, that policy can be terminated. A policy can also be terminated if it becomes redundant, in the sense that certain things have changed fundamentally in society to the effect that what the policy was seeking to address is no longer a problem worth paying attention in society. In that case, therefore, the policy can be terminated. A policy can also be terminated if it achieves its objectives. Once a given objective has been achieved, then there is no need for a policy to continue to exist when there is no clear problem that it is addressing. And on that basis, therefore, that policy can be terminated. So those are the various ways through which a policy can be terminated. So those are the stages or the processes that policy making goes through. I said there are 7. Problem identification as step 1, option analysis as step 2, formulation of the policy as step 3, adoption of the policy as step 4, implementation of the policy as step 5, and evaluation of the policy as step 6. The last step is called policy termination. Thank you so much for your time.